Welcome back to the table. Today, Ryan and I are going to give you a look at The Last Kingdom. This is a game based on a Netflix property you might be familiar with.
Yeah.
I mean, I was vaguely familiar with it, but I'd never watched it. After having played the game, I have watched the first episode and a half, and I'm intrigued enough to learn more. When we played this game, it was kind of like my first introduction to some of these characters, and I was kind of curious to see some of the thematic aspects that they put in here to see if they really pulled from, what those characters were all about.
Yeah, I mean, The Last Kingdom itself is based on a historical fiction, but it is based on a real historical event, which was the conflict between the Danes and the Saxons in what is now the United Kingdom. And that's kind of what this game does focus on. It kind of zooms out. So we're not looking at the individual character interactions, but we are looking at the actual battles or conflicts that happened across that land. And of course, the characters from the show do make appearances. You're going to be able to take on those characters as leaders or recruit some of those characters as heroes, which are going to kind of support your side. But it is a little bit different than what it might look like on the board in that this isn't a traditional area control game or a traditional dudes on a map game where you're leading armies into battle. You're more just like shepherding the conflicts and potentially changing your own allegiances throughout the course of the game to stick with the winning side.
Yeah, and let's back up for a second. We mentioned this is based on The Last Kingdom. It is coming from Gamelin Games and one of our favorite designers, John D. Clare, which was really kind of surprising for me to see him with his name on this. I don't think he's ever done IP games before, so it was really exciting to see.
He's got a big year, I'll say that.
But yeah, like Ryan was saying, this is a conflict-oriented game that works a little bit different. John had mentioned, and he mentions this in the rule book, that he took some inspiration from a couple of his favorite games, one of which was Blood Rage. And there's some drafting going on, which is sort of the really meaty part that I think feels most like Blood Rage. And then The King is Dead, which is where it's going to feel like how they resolve the conflict out here. The game structure overall is just going to last over 2 eras or 2 rounds. And you're going to do a drafting round, and then you're going to resolve the conflict, and then you do drafting again and resolve the conflict again, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean that's it. Sure,
so simple.
It is as simple as that, but there's so much that goes into all of the elements of this game. I mean, this is a deep strategy game of shifting alliances and future planning. I mean, you're managing a hand of cards and a number of action tokens for an entire round. So you're really, like we said, only doing 2 rounds, and the cards that you draft at the beginning of the round and the action tokens that you have at the beginning of the round have to last you an entire round. And an entire round is going from territory to territory on this board, resolving conflicts. And you're resolving conflicts by playing cards from your hand, by spending action tokens to play different actions. And then eventually, by the time you get to the end, you have to hope that you've still got enough stuff left that you have cards to play and things to do during that last conflict.
Yeah, the economies here are pretty tight. And the other thing that you should know is, like Ryan said off the bat, we're not going in with our own personal armies. There are the Danes and then the Saxons. Now, the Danes are just one type of army here, plus some of the heroes and your leaders yourself. But then the Saxons are made up of 3 different categories. And it's really interesting because no matter what region is being resolved, everyone has some skin in the game, if you will. Yeah. Even if their leader isn't in that territory, you're going to want to spend your time before the conflict resolution playing those cards, doing those things, spending your action points on some of these action tiles up here to manipulate things, not only for that territory, but potentially, let's say, oh, you know what? I'm not going to score a lot of points in a territory, given the circumstances. I might spend some of my action points and some of my things to set up what's going to happen next. And that's what Ryan was getting at with the sort of like thinking ahead. Yeah. And you do have to strategize. And do I play these cards now? Do I show this card now? Or do I save it to be a really big surprise towards the end? And then those action tokens?
They're tight.
They are super tight. You're going to start with X number of action tokens at the beginning of each round. But as you can see by these prices here, that's what you're mostly spending them on. To do some of those actions up there on the tiles, they can go away very quickly. Now, the good news is some of the cards you might get might give you more action tokens, and there are some cool benefits from being on the short end of the stick in some of the conflicts, because you might get a couple action tokens there too.
For losing, and so the conflicts, like all of this is based on one concept, and that is your allegiance. You are going to get to choose Well, as the game goes, you'll get to choose what your allegiance is going to be. You can take actions that flip your allegiance, and you're either going to be allied with the Danes or with the Saxons. And as David alluded to, if you're allied with the Saxons, you're allied with all three different Saxon factions. But the reason it matters, the reason there are three different factions, is because there's also this allegiance track. So not only are you worried about what allegiance you're currently flipped to, you're worried about how high you can get on these allegiance tracks because you're going to get points for those armies. It doesn't matter if I'm aligned with the Saxons and the Saxons win a conflict. If every army in there is Mercian, which is white, and I have 0 influence with white, I still score 0 points even though I was on the right side of that conflict. So learning how to manage that and also manipulate the forces that are on the board. So not only is your side winning, but you want your color, the one that you are highest on, to be most present in that conflict as well. Of course, other players are doing the same thing. They're trying to take your cubes out. So even when you are allied with other players at the table, even when you have 2 players fighting for the same faction, you might be battling out at which force is still strongest in that phase. So you're never really safe because there's a lot of manipulation happening and a lot of negotiating with other players. Like, if you don't touch my blue cubes, I won't touch your green cubes. We're on the same side. We really want to win this conflict. And that brings an interesting dynamic to the table.
Yeah, I will say that negotiation can be there. This is not a negotiation game by any means, but it can crop up because, especially with higher player counts, because I think you're going to see, oh, we've been kind of on the Dane side for a while. Are you going to do something about this, or am I? Right. And then you might even backstab each other because, like, you might go, oh, I'll do it, but then you don't. And then you switch allegiances at the end,
before the fight,
and you score points the other way around. A lot of that can happen, and a lot of the characters have a little bit of flavor like that, where I think, I haven't watched a lot of the show, but some of these characters feel a little more flip-floppy than others. In fact, all the characters start with their single allegiance where they're at, but you can flip it. But they also start with a lot of variable powers, so these are all going to feel very different. In fact, King Alfred here is actually one of the characters, I don't know if there's more, that cannot change their allegiance. They are on the Dane side, or they're on the Saxon side, period. They cannot go up the Dane affinity track. They can't switch their allegiance to affinity, but they have a power anytime they would do that, because there's a lot of cards and a lot of actions that allow them to do that, they take points instead. So you could sit as King Alfred and try to utilize that with some of the actions where Ryan might use it to change his affinity. You might kind of use it that way, but you're not changing it, you're just getting 5 points. And you can kind of abuse that a little bit.
Sure, for sure. So in every round, we talked about there being 2 rounds in the game. In every round, there's going to be 5 conflicts. The first player gets to decide where the first conflict is going to be. The second player gets to decide where the second conflict is going to be. So you kind of have some information about where you're going to be fighting in what row. This will pass around. There's a token you can take when you pass that lets you be the player to decide, but this will eventually hit all 5 of these areas. Every time you go to a conflict zone, it starts a new hand of play. But you're not getting more action tokens.
You're not getting more cards.
Those cards that you get at the beginning of the round, which is done via draft, like we said, have to be stretched out. So when you're looking at the first conflict, it's tempting to just play all of your cards, use all of your action tokens to manipulate that fight to a point where you win. And then, okay, we're done. We move on to the next conflict and you have nothing left. You can find ways, like David said, to earn more tokens. If you lose a fight or if your faction loses a fight, you can get some tokens. You could play some cards. And again, the cards do a lot of different things. They don't just give you extra tokens. They have powers. They can help you manipulate the battlefield. They can bring some of these hero figures onto the board, which add strength to combat and potentially give you special powers. There are permanent upgrades in there that just sit out. I mean, there are a ton of different things that these cards can do, and I don't think there are any duplicates in the entire deck. So you're looking at completely unique sets of cards that every player is going to have access to.
Yeah, I don't think there are duplicates. With that said, there are a lot of similar types of actions, not only on the cards, but on these action tiles. Because as you're sort of resolving a conflict and everyone's having their turns around the table, on your turn, you can take a primary action, and if you do, you're done. But then there's some secondary actions. If you take one of those, you can still take a primary action. If you don't take a primary action, you can pass.
Yep.
And this is one of those games where you're like, if you think other people are still going to go, I'll pass. And you pass, and it might come around. If people pass consecutively, then you're just looking at the end result. There's really nothing else happening at that point. You just kind of tally it up and then figure out who won and how the points are scored.
Yeah, and like David said, the points are going to be scored based on whether or not you win or lose the faction, and that's where this allegiance tracker comes into play. If you are the winning faction, you're going to look at the figures that are there, the cubes, which we have because we have a prototype here.
Yeah.
You're going to look at all the figures that are in that space that match your allegiance, and you're going to score points based on how high you are. So winning these fights is a really good way to score points. It's the main way that you're going to score points during the game. And if you manage to win a fight, if you're the only person allied with that faction, meaning everyone else is working against you, then you get an extra 5 points for being the solo faction. Of course, it's a lot harder because everything that every player is doing over the course of that conflict round is to ensure that their side wins. Or maybe not, because you might want to lose in order to get more of those tokens. And by looking ahead at where the succession marker is, maybe I've decided I'm not going to spend my time and effort on winning this. I'm going to plan ahead and start putting troops and positioning my leader in a way that I can influence that second fight or the next fight that's happening. And so you never really can be sure what other players at the table are going to do.
No, you absolutely can't. People can flip-flop quite a bit. And that action economy of those action tokens is something you're constantly thinking of, because you might go, okay, like Ryan said, you know, I'm going to lose here. It's going to give me 2 action tokens.
Right.
I have one already. That'll give me the 3 I need to take this action next round and do this and that. So there's a lot of planning that goes into that, and you go around it. And there's also a lot of sneaky cards that come out too.
There are a lot of sneaky cards. These decks, especially the Age 2 deck, a lot of sneaky cards, and every character has 2 of their own cards, which kind of fit their own play style that are very sneaky as well.
Yeah, there are cards that let you basically say, oh, you know this one that we resolved? Nope, we didn't resolve it. Or we did, but we're resolving it again. So if it's a region that you resolved to your advantage and scored lots of points, you could score it again. And if it's at the end of the round, everyone's spent their action tokens and their cards, so there's not a lot that's going to stop you again.
Yeah, and there are actions that move cubes around, that add cubes to the board, that remove cubes, that remove troops, that even can change where the conflict marker goes. There's a lot of different things that can be done with these cards, and you never know really what other people have in their hand. Of course, there's a draft, so you do get a little bit of information because you look at your hand.
Yeah.
That's where I feel like that kind of Blood Rage inspiration, because I know what I'm passing David. I know he's going to take one of those cards, and eventually you're going to end up with 6 cards in your hand, 4 from the draft and your 2 hero cards. But that's really, those 6 cards are what you're going to get. There is one action that lets you potentially draw more, but besides those actions and then these public actions, that's really what you get to do. And man, spacing them out so that when you get to the end, you still can help. That's a huge part of the strategy of the game, for sure.
It's a huge part of the strategy, and it takes some getting used to. I think when we first started playing, we all had the tendency to just keep playing during that first region.
Yeah, it feels like you
and
have
then
so
I'm
much to
like,
do.
oh, wait a minute. I'm not going to have anything left to do anything else. Now, with that said, you might lose a couple regions so you can get some of those tokens back and get things back on track. But you do want to pace yourself between each of the 2 rounds.
Yeah, so there is a huge timing element to this game. You want to, again, be on the winning side when the winning side wins, but it costs time tokens or action tokens to switch your allegiance unless you have a card that does it. So timing that is important. Timing when to play your cards. Some cards require specific board states to be able to be triggered. So you need to kind of manipulate the board to get to that particular state. And there's also a whole timing element with these action tokens, because as a player takes one of these actions, it moves down to the end and everything slides down. So these actions will become cheaper. You'll notice that some of them are 6. If you wait long enough, they might get down to 3, but somebody might decide to pay 4, and now it's back to 6. So
yeah, you don't want to wait too long for those. Some of the characters even have cards that say, oh, I'm going to move the cheapest one to the end of the row. So if you waited that long, and then you lose your opportunity to pay 3, that hurts.
It's all about timing, and it's all about managing these conflicts. And you're just going to keep moving this around. You're going to do a conflict, and then you're going to decide who won that conflict just based on the strength that's there after everyone has passed. Whoever wins that conflict, everyone gets their points, everyone gets their action tokens, and then you just keep moving these around the board and doing the conflicts in that order until all 5 conflicts are done. And really, you just do that process twice.
Yeah.
Once for round 1, once for round 2. And you're scoring, I mean, by the end of the second round, hopefully have your allegiance tokens pretty high up, so you're scoring some massive points. So everything that happens in round 1 is kind of setting the stage for how well you're going to do in round 2.
Yeah, and there's really no end game scoring, but we didn't mention these player shields. You're going to keep your action tokens behind there so people can't keep track of that. You're also going to keep your points behind there, because at the end, everyone just lifts up their player shields and they add up your points in front of you.
Which is a good thing, because there are some times in the game where you almost want to have like a King of the Hill situation or a Kingmaker situation where somebody you think, oh, they have a lot of points. Let's not let them, like, let's all be the opposite side. So, like, let's make them lose other conflicts. But then it might turn out that somebody else had way more points. You don't really know. So you can't really worry about targeting a player, because all it can do is maybe feel like they're ahead. You never really know who's ahead.
Yeah, you can kind of keep track of that if you really pay attention. But in our 3-player game, I don't think any of us knew who was going to win.
No, it was...
In fact, I had been leading a good portion of the time, and I thought I actually had a good chance. I came in last, but it was all pretty tight.
It was very tight.
It was very
Our
close.
game was very tight that we played. Yeah, and so I would say it is a deeply strategic game. People that did like... I think another inspiration was The King is Dead.
Yes.
You'll see a lot of that with the
way it's
different
resolved,
factions. So,
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, an interesting twist on area control and dudes on a map games.
Yeah, if you have any questions at all, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.